Let's come and notice that your directions tell you to dissolve the yeast. This is what it looks like when you dissolve yeast and you put it in warm water about 110 to 115 degrees, and it would look like this. It is now ready to go ahead and work to make the dough. The other thing I like to do before I start is to prepare my pan. This is a double recipe, so when I make the double recipe, I use my large Dutch oven for to raise the dough. I like to take shortening, put it on wax paper, cover my fingers, and grease the pan so that when the dough has been kneaded and it's ready to raise, that the pan is ready to go, and it's just one of those steps. So now I'll go back to the recipe and put the flour, the liquids, the yeast, and every ingredient that's a part of making the dough together with my mixer. I have mixed my dough as long to the thickness that the mixture will do the job. Now I'm going to have to stir it by hand, so I'm adding more flour, and I'm going to be stirring this until it has gotten so stiff that I can no longer stir it, and then I will knead it. If you notice later on in the demonstration that this dough looks different than the sweet dough that will be used for the actual sticky buns, it's because we are recreating the first steps in making the bread dough, and this dough happens to be for my whole wheat bread recipe, and it has much more texture and color than the sweet dough recipe has. We'll show you this step until I can no longer stir it, and then I'll begin to show you how to knead bread for whatever type of yeast dough product you might be making. Alright, now if you look at this dough, it's getting really stiff. It's about as stiff as I can handle it with stirring it, so I'm going to get my table ready so that I can knead the dough. I want to put flour down, and this is a process that is going to take time. So when I actually start kneading it, I will knead bread dough for at least 10 minutes. Now, in thinking about making those sticky buns that we're working on today, I would suggest that you don't want to start that project unless you have at least 4 to 5 hours to devote to making sticky buns. It's not that you're going to be involved all that time, but the total process would at least take that long with the time that you're going to have the dough raising. So here we go, and now I'll put a little bit more flour over this, and the process of kneading involves pushing with the palm of your hands and pulling the dough. Whoops, got it on me, but that's okay. And working this until it's nice and smooth. And like I said, I will be at this for the next 10 minutes when I'm making this type of dough. If you were doing the sweet dough, your recipe is going to say until the dough can be handled, but I have found that generally takes 10 minutes too. Rock and turn, and then you want to push and you turn your bread dough some more and keep working your flour into the dough. If you don't put enough flour on to start with, your dough will stick to your table and it will be a mess and stick to your hands. Or if you put too much flour on, it's very difficult to work it into the dough. So it's really a gradual process as you work more of the flour that you've already put down on the board in. It will become necessary to add a little bit more and just keep working on it. Okay, the 10 minutes of kneading is complete. You can see the texture has changed. I want to work in the last of the flour that's still on my table, and I want my dough to look nice and smooth. The consistency has changed dramatically as this kneading will help the gluten to form that will help the bread to rise. Now it's basically finished. I will put it into my bowl Dutch oven that I have greased, and I'm going to put it in like this, and then I turn it upside down so that the grease that has touched it kind of covers and finishes the surface, covers the surface and keeps it a little more moist. And now I will cover it with a cloth and put it in a warm place. Ideally, bread would rise the best at 85 degrees. It won't be that warm here, but I will put it to in a warm place for at least an hour. It will double in size in that time if the yeast is working well, and then it will be ready to be shaped. Good morning. This is Christmas Eve morning, and I'm getting ready to make sticky buns. This is the dough that's already prepared. It is here to raise while I prepare the pans. So this is a yeast dough, sweet yeast dough recipe. I like to keep it covered. Yeast dough will rise better that way. Now we're going to go see our pans. To get ready for it, I have a couple of steps here. I used to take a stick of butter per pan, jelly roll pan like this. I put it down to 6 tablespoons last year, thought it was a little skimpy, so this year I'm going with 7 tablespoons per jelly roll pan. What was left over is in this particular saucepan, which I will melt to spread with a pastry brush on my dough at a later point. Pastry brushes that are plastic are nicer in the dishwasher to get them nice and clean than if you have a regular bristle brush. And so that's butter. We have this ready to go, and now we're ready for the next step, which is what I'm suggesting is a 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar. It could be changed as far as the amount, but I like to think that this is enough sugar, and some people would probably be happy with less, but it seems to me that this is sufficient, or you could have more. But I'm taking a half measuring cup first, and I'm sprinkling it over my melted butter, which I try to have as even as possible. And now this needs another 1/4 of a cup at least. I mean, I'll do another 1/4 of a cup. But to keep this video going so you don't have to watch it, I have this pan prepared. And now this pan is going to get the chopped nuts, which have been chopped ahead of time just to make this step a little faster. And the recipe I'm suggesting is, excuse me, it says a 1/4 cup chopped nuts. I'm thinking that maybe that's too skimpy. So let's add a 1/2 cup here. And so now this is ready for the following step, which is to take some cinnamon. And you could take a measuring spoon, but I just kind of guess, and I try to put it on very sparingly so I don't get large clumps of cinnamon. It might be easier to put some in a salt shaker, and figure that possibly about that much, a 1/2 teaspoon would be plenty. This pan is now ready for the sticky buns. When we have them ready, I'll show you that point in another step. These pans are ready. I just wanted to point out this pan has only 2 tablespoons of butter. It is a 8-inch round pan, and it doesn't have as much because this one is going to be eaten by either Dad and us, or we give this one to Aunt Rosie also. But I use the ends, and they are delighted with the ends, and they don't have as much butter and sugar on as the regular ones. This is a 9-inch round pan. This one had 1/4 cup of butter and about 1/3 cup of sugar, and then nuts till it looks good, and you'll see the cinnamon there. This will flip over nicely, and I will give this on a large round paper plate that has been lined with foil when we take it, let's say, to the Huffs, so that they get at least 5 or 6 in one round pan, and the presentation is good. Okay, I'm now ready to work with my yeast dough, my sweet yeast dough. I'm going to roll it out, and when I do a double recipe from years of doing this, I know that it works best for me if I divide this amount of dough into three times. So with one recipe, you might want to do it, to do it all at one time, I think would be too much. You might have to do it twice. So I'm going to take and punch it down. After it's raised, you can see these air bubbles. You don't want air bubbles. There'll be holes in your dough, and I'm going to kind of just using regular judging on my own, I'm going to divide it into what I think is about 1/3 of the amount of dough. I have floured my board table and also floured my rolling pin. Too much flour is going to make them ugly, and it's going to make it tough, your dough tough, so you want to be sure that you don't have too much flour, but you also don't want it to stick to your surface, to your table. So now I'm going to roll this out, and I will show you the size after I finish rolling it. Depending on how thick you want the bread part of your sticky bun will depend on how thin you want to make this, but I've rolled it trying to get somewhat in an even rectangle. Now my first step is to take the melted butter that I had in the saucepan and brush. I want to brush the dough with butter, and not too much at the edges because it'll just move out, but you don't want it too hot either. This might be a little warm because of the yeast, but put a nice layer of melted butter on your dough. A little bit more here. Now we're going to take that brown sugar that we used before, and let's take, again, about 3/4 of a cup, but let's start with a cup and a 1/2 cup and see how that looks. We'll sprinkle that over the surface of the rolled out sweet dough. Now the next step, after you've put the sugar, is 3/4 of a cup. I'm going to take the chopped nuts, and I'm going to use, this is a 1/4 cup measuring cup, so I'm going to use 2 of these for a 1/2 cup of chopped nuts. And I found that chopping the nuts, as much as I don't like them quite this fine, for normal things they stick to the dough a little better. And again, now I'm going to take cinnamon, because these are cinnamon sticky buns, and put some cinnamon over my mixture. And then I'm ready to roll it like we call rolling up a jelly roll. So I'm going to take the edges, and I want to roll them as if it starts to stick, use a turner with a little flour on it. But what you want to do is roll it as tight as you can at this point. Well, not as tight as you can, but rather tight, so that you have the looks that you need. And like I said, if it sticks, you're going to have to loosen it carefully so you don't get a real thin area of the dough. Now this is all rolled together. You'll see that at the ends it doesn't have as much of the sugar and the nuts, and so that's why I do that on a separate pan, the pan that doesn't have as much butter, so that it's still edible. But I have taken some thread and cut a piece of thread, and now I'm ready to start to cut my rolls. If you see what I'm doing, I'm taking the thread, putting it under the roll of dough, making it about a 1/2 inch thick, and this one still won't have as much in the center, and so I'm going to put that one over here on the other pan. This is looking good, so I put it underneath the jelly roll of dough, and I just cross over the thread like this, and it cuts the dough much nicer than any knife would do. And then I pick up my sticky bun, and I want to put the cut end down first. And I want this to be big enough, hoping that 3 sticky buns across the pan this way, and I think it's 5 across this way, will be big enough that when it is raised, it will pretty much cover the pan so that there isn't the sugar that's going to burn while it's baking. Okay. After you have cut enough for the pan like this, pretty much, we will put a tea towel over it and let it raise, and then it will get it ready. It will take about an hour, and in the meantime I'll continue to get the next pans ready, and then it will be ready to bake. Your sticky buns are going to be baked for probably about 10 to 15 minutes. I know I don't bake mine as long as a lot of people do, but at 350 degrees, I like them lightly browned. When I remove them from the oven, my pan from the oven, I like to let it sit on a hot pad for perhaps a minute. Then I take the sticky buns and cover the pan of sticky buns with another cookie sheet that is a little bit larger, makes it a little easier if you're using a smaller pan, just as long as it's a larger base, and quickly turn it upside down. And those sticky buns should fall, and then you're ready to perhaps take your pancake turner, and if there's any of the sugar mixture that's still on top of the on the bottom of the other pan, put it on top of your sticky buns, kind of like this. You'll see I've had a little extra there just to make sure that none of it's wasted. And then you're ready to let those sticky buns cool. Take them apart because you want them to touch each other, which we talked about earlier, before you put them into the oven, and they are ready to serve. And they're most delicious when they are warm.